So, hey, I am Nathan Case, and this is going to be a really fun talk about what to do with CISOs. I wrote this talk originally when I was trying to figure out the best way for a CISO to interact with a company. And part of my background is actually working with large cloud providers and sitting with CISOs all over the country and trying to figure out what the best way to be a CISO and actually implement security in a large enterprise is. And so I kind of wrote this with a bit of a tongue in cheek in that, I've been a CISO before and I would like to be again. That's kind of one of the things that people generally aspire to. But what does that actually mean and how does that work? And as we go through this, there's going to be a couple of pieces that are a little bit hard and I'm going to do my best to kind of connect them for you. But this is kind of a different talk than I normally give. So this week I'm actually at Hacker Summer Camp. So I'm in Vegas and I'm about to go over to Las Vegas B-Sides and do a talk on hacking and incident response and different things that happen in OT networks. This is a very different talk. This is a talk about culture and the way to deal with being a CISO and the way to, frankly, include security in the things you do. So getting into it, the history of CSOs, Chief Security Officers. So generally when I would give this, we're all in a room and I'd ask you to raise your hands and we talk about being a CSO. And way back in the beginning, a CSO was the Chief Security Officer. She was, at the time, it was probably an Army person that had a weapon and they would make sure that people didn't get into a front door or into a security area. And it was really simple. The concept was the information stayed in one place and we in World War I, World War II were keeping people away from it. And that's fine. That is what it was. And as we think about the concept of information security back then, it was pretty simple, right? I mean, there were no internets to be tricking data out of the network on. There were no SMB shares. There were no process injections. It was strictly a bunch of paper. So how did that change? What changed from now? And as we think about it, we have to get into the word cybersecurity. Now, I had somebody approach me yesterday and say that Neil Gaiman actually created cybersecurity. I think they were thinking about Neil Stephenson, and I think it was metaverse. But still, the concept here is that way back in the 80s, we came up with this word cybersecurity, and we kind of attached that to what the CSOs were. Okay, so security, it kind of fits together. And cyber meaning to be able to direct or control. So we're going to control security. And I guess that kind of makes sense, but the intent in the article and the intent in 89 was to be a little bit creepy and a little bit scary. And I think as we think about what cybersecurity has become and what security in many of the companies has become, it tends to hold that sort of militaristic feel. And so one of the things I want to do today is kind of strip that back and say, this is actually what security is. And we're going to talk about where it comes from. So from my point of view, going to college and having talked about security and cybersecurity, this is generally what I think of when I think of cybersecurity. Now, we're in a room, I'm going to ask you who's heard of Creeper and who's heard of Reaper. Creeper is the first, I suppose we'll call it a worm or malware, that went around different mainframes and typed, "I'm the Creeper, catch me if you can," at the top in green letters, Blinky and all of that. And it was fun. At the time, I'm sure Bob Thomas had a really, big giggle with his friends that he was able to get this to bounce around to all the terminals, but it was network aware. So it could actually but it could actually bounce around. And then a person with a little less fun in his mind, a little bit less hacker in his heart, Ray Tomlinson decided, you know what, we need to fix that. It's a waste of resources. And so he went ahead and cleaned it up. So this is the first cat and mouse reality that we can point to in the cyber world. That said, I'm going to push back a little bit and I'm going to go back to World War II. And we're going to talk about people like Violet Sabo, an amazing woman that actually was a strawberry picker and a telephone operator that was one of the interesting people that joined the fight against the Germans. Now, I bring this up because as we go through this talk, I'm going to point out things that I want you to key on. And one of the things I want you to key on is we kind of had this question of what is security and who should be doing security and how do we get security into a culture solved in the 40s. And we've kind of drifted away from that. So way back when, Violet here was one of the individuals that did a bunch of really cool work with a portion of the British operations called SOE. And if you've never heard of SOE or OSS and you don't like history, I'm passionately sorry, but it's really pretty cool. So SOE was this concept that we had to figure out a new way to be secure and do different things in World War II because we weren't winning. We were very much not winning. And the concept here is that as we take these things apart, we had things that came up that we had to figure out and we had to solve. And some of those things were really basic. And this is a great book about how to acquire and why silk was really important in World War II and how this whole thing came together. And as we think about the things that come together in this World War II picture that I'm trying to paint for you, I want you to think about Violet. I want you to think about people like Alan Turing. I want you to think about different things like the bomb, not the explosive bomb, but the bomb that actually solved the Enigma. And I want you to think about the people that actually began to do the work that solved how the Allies were going to be facing the Axis powers in that particular war. And really good book. I would definitely suggest it. I actually read this thinking it was a bit of a fantasy book or a false history book, but it's not. It's really pretty awesome. So if you get a minute and you want to read about this, this is where I would go. So let's talk a little bit about what security is. And we're going to break here and kind of move into what the future is, or what the future is, the current is now. So if we think about what happened in World War II, and we stop for a minute and we think about what's current, and this is one of those hard breaks that I kind of bring up, we're going to talk about security. Security means free from care, according to the Latin. Now, I don't know how many security people are on, but I would wager if we were all sitting in a very large room and I said, hey, raise your hand, how many of you security people are free from care? Almost no one would raise their hand. Now, that's kind of an important thing, because as we think about this, I have questions as to who else would raise their hand. If you're a developer, and I use the word risk, do you really feel like you're free from care? Are you in a place where your security team is balancing and doing the things that you need to do so well that you can raise your hand and say, yes, I am indeed free from care? Now, when somebody says the word risk to me, these are three things that pop into my mind. So if you want to play along at home, then you can go ahead and say the word risk and think about what are the first three things that you think about. Now, as a security geek and a relatively technical security geek, this is what I think about. Now, I've actually done some physical security work before in the past. I've been a bit of a red teamer, and I've definitely been an incident responder. So when you kind of like unpack what I wrote here, it fits. So the question that I would have when we talk about a developer, when we talk about a project manager, when we talk about a CFO, what are the things that actually go through your head? And what does being a CISO mean to you? And I ask that question not because being a CISO is something that I have an opinion about. I do, but rather I ask the question from a CFO, from a developer, from whoever else is out there, because your opinion about what the CISO, the CISO is actually far more important than what my opinion is. And the reason for that is that you're the people that we actually serve. So when we think about ways to impact the things in your life, I want to make sure that I am the CISO that you would want me to be. And generally speaking, as we think all the way back to Violet, and we think about the things that the CSOs did, they were the people that they were supposed to be. They kept people out of the room with the paper. And as we think about today, what is that CISO supposed to do? What is the actual goal? How does security get pushed into the things around us? Well, if we think back to Creeper and Reaper, was the CISO really involved in any of this? And I would argue that no, they were not, because the CISO was still pretty much the CSO, which was the guy that was just making sure people didn't get in the room. So if there was no CISO here, and Ray Tomlinson decided that he was going to fix this, who told him to do that? Why did he do that? Well, I would argue that he did that because he was a good developer. Now, these are the general silos that we all think about. We think about development, we think about security, and we think about operations. We have words for all three of these: DevOps, DevSecOps, DevOps Sec, SecDevOps. You get the point. But we've effectively split things up into three silos, and we've kind of taken these apart. And the intent was that, in my opinion, We have development, which is a very specific practice. We have security, which was intended to be a very specific practice. And we have operations, which was a very specific practice. And two of these things make a lot of sense. Is development an individual typing on a keyboard, creating code similar to operations? Well, honestly, no. I totally believe in DevOps, and don't hate me for that statement. But the reality here is development is a different practice than operations. Operations is running a thing and making sure a thing stays alive. And development is banging on the keyboard and making the thing that we're going to make sure stays alive. Now, that leaves us with security. We're going to get into this deeper as we go, but how does security differ from those two things? What is the difference between a security person working on a development tool or a security person working on our operations tool? And as we take that apart, I want you to think about that a little bit. Now we have risk. Let's talk about risk again. We kind of did this a second ago. What is risk in operations versus risk in security? Well, if I'm an operator, maybe I'm not thinking about the things that Nathan thinks about. Maybe I'm thinking about the things that you think about. Maybe it's, hey, the servers are down. Or maybe we're talking about resilience and we're talking about how we need to architect for resilience. Also good. That's great. But that's not security. Now, interestingly, security might come in here. So as we talk about resilience and we talk about the things that go into operations, we might talk about securely onboarding a new user or onboarding a new employee. Well, that's interesting. Now, operationally, I've got to do a thing, but I've got to do it well. So is security in operations really a statement of appropriate action? A statement of, hey, I did a thing and I did it the right way. So consequently, operations is really SecOps. Maybe. What about development? So as we go back to this slide from a minute ago, and we think about physical risk or risk, we've got my answers over here on the left. We've got your answers on the right. If you think about risk from a development point of view, maybe it's missing a deadline. Maybe you are, let's be honest, maybe you're actually paid more if you get things done in a deadline. Maybe you get paid more, maybe you get a bonus if you get things done in a sprint. Totally possible. When I started out, I actually started out as a developer. And I would bang away at the keyboard. And if I got things done in a sprint and I got my projects done on time, I was generally bonused for that. Okay, so one of the risks that I would think about from that point of view might well be, hey, did I get my bonus this month? Did I put enough stuff out? Did enough stuff go out of what we're doing right now into the world around us? Did I produce enough stuff? And if I didn't, maybe that's one of the risks. Now, interestingly, if I'm a developer and I write bugs, what happens? Have I just created a risk? Well, yeah, you have, but actually that's one of the risks that a developer might worry about. So really, when we think about this and we think about resiliency and we think about security, there's a real good opportunity here where we may actually have a security thing coming into development. So I'm going to ask the question similar to the one that I asked about operations a second ago. Is security just a statement of good development? Similar to, is security a statement of good operations? I got to be honest, part of me kind of feels like yes. And so I'm going to bring you to this screen. And this is an interesting screen, and this is a bit of a shift as well. So hang out with me for a second. So this is one of the things that Deloitte did recently. And they asked a bunch of COOs and CEOs and chief executive people, what do you feel the CISO should be doing? And it's interesting because the answers are vastly different. And I'm going to point out that last one. Guardian is at 22%. Guardian, for those of us that feel like we are being CISOs or being security people, may well be the thing that we focus on. But I will point out, as we talked about way back in the beginning when we said, hey, what is a CISO? The people around us do not feel the same way. So I think one of the things that we see right now is that most CISOs only exist at a company for 18 months. That's a really short tenure. And when we talk about things that occur during that 18 months, projects get kicked off, things happen, we've got to clean up messes, all of these things occur, but it doesn't really let the business get to a point of good flow, good functionality in 18 months. Well, why would they get rid of their CISOs in 18 months? Well, one of the things Deloitte is pointing out here is that their focus is wrong. So as a CISO, are we supposed to focus on being the guardian all of the time? Currently, it looks like, according to Deloitte and Touche, that effectively 41%, or rather, CISOs feel that 41% of their time should be spent making things secure, as opposed to 22% that their peers think that they should be doing. So we're spending almost twice as much time making things secure. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I have felt very overworked recently when it comes to being a security person. And one of the reasons that I would point out there is that, hey, maybe we're focused on the wrong things. Maybe we're focused on being a guardian too much and not the advisor. People really want us to come into development, to come into operations and build with them, collaborate with them, not to tell them no. They want us to find new ways and new things to do. Well, that's a pretty big statement because that's a massive change from where a lot of people are today. Now, I've spent a lot of time with really cool CISOs that had really interesting, very good philosophies. One of the CISOs that I got to work with was Mr. Schmidt from AWS, and he was the CISO at AWS for a long time. And he's recently moved over to Amazon now, and he's focused over there. But one of the things that was the core principle for him was that you're not allowed to say no. And I've talked to a couple other CISOs at different companies recently, and they've also given me the statement that, one of the things we really strive to do here is not say no. That means that we need to be the advisors. We need to push security into other places. And so as we go all the way back to the beginning of this talk, and we think about Violet, and we think about all the other things that we've said so far, I want to be clear. Security isn't about what I do. Security is about what we all do. And I get it. It can feel like that's a push, but I think what we're seeing here is a statement that we all kind of know it anyway. So when we think about what is a good CISO then, and we try to take apart what this is, there are really three types of CISOs. We have a CISO like me. I am a technical CISO probably. And that CISO is going to be focused on all the cool things that happen in security. We're going to take things apart and we're going to put things back together and we're going to make sure that they're all secure. And all of that's great. And all of that's really important. But I'm getting to the point in my career now where I look around and I see the things that exist in the world around me. And there are other types of CISOs. We have the networking or communications CISO, and we have the dedication or loyalty CISO. Now, those are very different things. And I think people can, in some ways, let's be honest, look down on a communicative CISO or a dedicated CISO. Now, what does that mean? Well, a dedicated CISO, as it states on the slide here, is really an executive that's been with a company for a long period of time. And that executive might feel like, I don't know, maybe they've done this thing for so long that the company, and not even being a CISO, maybe it's something else. Maybe they've been a CTO, CIO, or maybe they've just been the CFO or chief legal counsel in some cases. They've proven themselves to the company. They've proven that they're a loyal employee. They've proven that they're really good at the executive role. And when that happens, it means that the company, all of us, trust that person with this new thing. Now, interestingly, I've seen this type of the CISO really work out well. These types of CISOs generally turn into people that maybe they don't know security to begin with, and that's okay. They learn CISOing, they learn security on the job, as it were. And generally, because they have the trust of their partners, they have the trust of the company, it works out really well. Now, that brings us to the networking CISO. See, communication is really interesting too. Most of the job of CISO is communicating. It's about looking into the camera and making sure that people on the other side of the camera understand that you're there for them. And you're trying to make sure that their lives go well. Now, keeping in mind that advising is really what people are looking for. So the communicative CISO is frankly the one that people, I think, are seeing succeed right now. Now, I'll point this out. In one of my jobs previously, I got to work with a lot of CISOs, and I kind of talked about that at the beginning of the talk. But one of the things that surprised me most was a CISO out of Chicago. And I got to go sit in his office and we talked about his strategic plans. And we took apart everything and we talked about all the things, and yay. But the point here that I'm going to make is that this very nice person was not in any way, shape, or form a security person. When I asked this person about their security strategy for the next few years, they smiled at me and said NIST. Is that bad? It did catch me a bit off guard. There was no actual security strategy. They knew that they wanted to implement some portion of NIST controls, but were unsure as to exactly how to elicit that from the world around them or use language that allowed them to deal with that. Now, interestingly, this person had a wonderful staff. And what they were able to do was communicate the needs of the company in a non-security way to an extremely technical, frankly, amazing security staff that respected this individual so much that they were able to take the things that they said and turn them into, and I kid you not, an amazing security strategy. And it was one of those moments as a technical person, as a technical CISO type, I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is just crap. And then you take the whole thing apart and you realize that it is probably the most well-oiled machine you've ever seen. And I think as we look at being a CISO and we talk about what CISOs need to do and we talk about how CISOs work, stories like this are really important because we tend to get really bound up in this concept of, I need to know all the things. I need to be very technical. No, you need to be able to communicate, and you need to be able to communicate in such a way that you build trust with the people that you're working with. Oops. There we go. Now, we talked about this, 8 months to a year and a half. If we think about the fact that a CISO is only existing for a year and a half, 18 months at best, right? And we talk about the impact that has on the business. What does that look like? Does that look like a good thing for the business? Does that look like a good thing for the CISO? If I start a project and the CISO is involved, let's say that we pick up a new security tool, and I'm not pointing out that you need new security tools, but rather that we pick up a new security tool. And CISO 1 says that we need a new security tool, and CISO 2 that's going to come halfway through then has to figure out why we purchased a tool. Does that project seem like it will end well? And I'm going to go with no. So we also have a lot of burnout here, okay? Now, if we take this back from the CISO and we just think about, honestly, all security people, when we talk about all security people in general, we're not just talking about CISOs burning out and 48% of the time, yeah, that sucks. But security people in general, we're looking at 85% of the time people are feeling burned out right now. Well, okay. So let's extrapolate a little bit. Let's take this concept that our peers at an executive level are saying they really want advice. They really want us to come in and help them do stuff. But we're coming in and trying to protect them. But they still want us to do stuff. So what happens? Well, what happens is that we end up doing all of the advising that we needed to do, spending extra time defending, and then not really doing a good job of communicating about why we're doing the things that we're doing. So consequently, we all get burned out. So is there a way around this? Well, let's talk about the silos again. A little bit ago, we talked about the fact that the silos, 2 of the silos, are very different than the third. 2 of the silos actually have something to do with an active thing that you're going to go do. One of those silos, security, deals more with the things about the other 2. So I am going to tell a developer that you need to code better. I'm going to tell a developer that you need to do application security, that you need to do, take your pick of different thing inside of that. Maybe we need to talk about Vuln and Vex. Maybe we need to talk about software security supply chain. Maybe we need all of the things. But the developer is really the one doing a lot of that work. So maybe there's a different way to look at this. And if we talk about operations and we talk about security operations, we talk about the things that go into how do we operate in a resilient, in a secure model that allows us to have really good operations. I would love to onboard new person, have a new person stuff magically happen, make sure that their endpoint is being appropriately monitored, make sure that the XDR is doing all the things it needs to do, make sure that all of the logs are going back to a SIEM so that we can all have observability. How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, I'm going to point out that the way we've got things set up right now, that a CISO being the person that is supposed to guard all of us and the security staff is effectively a plan for failure. That effectively, way back in the 70s, in the 80s, when we started thinking about what cybersecurity is and began to build this pyramid, this silo of cybersecurity, we actually planned for failure. What we did was to decide that of the 3 silos, security was a silo in and of itself, and it needed special people. It needed people to focus on it, and it needed people to think about it. Developers shouldn't have to think about security. The security person should be able to inject security into what they do. And I've spent a significant portion of my career trying to figure out how to build things so that a developer could shift, so we could shift something left to that developer, so that we could have that developer have the tools that they needed to do security. And I think that's ideal. That's still a good thing. But as we think about what security is, I almost wonder if development shouldn't be its own separate thing. And the same is true with operations. So as we think about the way operations works, can we actually shift things like observability that we were getting from development and that we wanted in security into operations? And all of a sudden, all three of us use the same tools so that we actually have a singular unit that actually is going to be something, I'm going to use the word DevSecOps, but you get the point, something that is really legitimately development, operations, and security all kind of jammed together. What does that end up being? Well, that ends up meaning that while there is a security pillar, it's not really a security pillar of let me go protect you, let me go guard you. It's my responsibility when there's an incident, and let's be honest, that's kind of what I've spent most of my life doing is incident response. It turns into a question of how can I advise you, my development family member, so that we can actually come to a better point security-wise, and a better point development-wise, and a better point business-wise, and a better point fiscally for the company at large. So I think as we take a step back and we think about the silos that we've created accidentally, we've screwed up. The reality is that if we want to get to this point of free from care, which is the actual meaning of the word security, well, I don't know that we ever really reach it. It ends up being a journey. It ends up being something that, you know what, today, this week, I'm in Hacker Summer Camp and I'm having a hell of a time. It's great fun, but I am free from care this week. And I think that's okay. Why? Because I have teammates and friends and family that suddenly are carrying some of that burden with me. And we're doing it together. It's not just me. So as we think about these things, and why is that important? Well, let's be very, very honest. As we talk about the people in the world around us, right now we have about 88.4 million professionals in the US that are doing things. And those professionals are doing really good work. It's not a point that they're not. It's not a point that they're not doing good security work necessarily, but of those 84 million, there are about 1.2 million that actually are security people. And this is kind of one of those moments where I'm shifting the cube a little bit again for you. Realistically, in the United States, security people make up 1.3% of the workforce. That means if we don't agree with me and we want to go the other way on this one, and we want to go ahead and do things like my security team is the team that does all the security and developers don't have to worry about it and operations don't have to worry about it. We're going to do all the security. You've got about 99 people that you need to go ahead and make up space for. So for each security person, that's 99 other people that you need to go take care of the security for. So as we think about the whole and we think about all the things going on, we all understand the world around us, I'm sure. So there are 88 million people in the world? No, there aren't. There are about 8 billion people in the world. So if there are 88.4 million people in the United States, and we're one of 100 effectively in the United States, and we all know that all of the threats in the cyber world come from, well, the United States. No, wait, they don't just come from the United States, do they? They come from everybody else as well. So that number of 1 to 99 turns into a much different number. And as we think about it, 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 10,000, suddenly the fact that we're outnumbered is really, really pointed. And so what do we end up thinking about? Well, I'm going to point out that in the 40s, we had this solution. When we talked about Alan Turing and we talked about Bletchley Park and we talked about all of those things, we talked about Violet Sabo and we talked about the things that she did. So one of the things that we as security did, and frankly, we as developers, because let's be honest, at that point, developers honestly were the women in the project for Bletchley Park that twisted the little knobs and set the different dials specifically and actually punched the cards. But that's kind of development at the time. They didn't write code. They did make the ones and the zeros differently. But that whole team was about as diverse as you could possibly get. And it was diverse in such a way that they included anybody that wanted to help them. And I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that we've really gone to the point where in '89, and we started making this concept of cybersecurity, it turned into a thing where it was an exclusive club that you needed to start playing with. I've got background in cybersecurity, so consequently, I can do this. Well, you know what? When we started doing cybersecurity, really, nobody cared. And we made lots of progress. And to be fair, we won World War II. There's proof to say that this actually works out quite well. So what I'm going to point out to you is that I think the way forward is to take the things that we got out of the SOE, that we got out of the LSS, to take the lessons that we learned in 1940 and bring them all the way back to now and say that, you know what, security is everybody's job and everybody should be included. It's not a question of people who've been ex-military. It's not a question of people who have gone to college. It's not a question of people who actually know the regulations and the things that go into being FedRAMPed or being anything else. It's a question of who actually wants to participate and help. Now, does that mean that I think that we get to a point where anybody can join and do anything? Well, no, obviously not. You need some training. But at the same point, there was a very nice individual that approached me last weekend at a job fair, and they asked for a job. They had absolutely no background. And over the course of the next week, we were able to get the person reading books and get into GRC. And now they're actually being able to go and intern for a GRC company in Ohio. That's the ideal. We should be able to take anybody that approaches us as security people. And I realize I'm making this kind of a big thing, but we should be able to take this thing as a security person and say, you know what? I should be ready to help somebody else. I should be ready to mentor my developer, my operations friends, my operations family, my development family, and get them into security and give them things to read and understand so that we can all do security together. And I think that's how we actually get to some of these things. We have to avoid things like cultural fit and no background. We have to avoid needs to learn our lingo. We have to avoid things like, well, they don't know FedRAMP or they don't know ISO 9000 or 20, whatever. None of that stuff is important. As we get into the things that exist in today's society, I think we have to accept the people that are out there for just who they are. And if they want to do security, sure, okay, let me help you. Let's find a good place for you to sit. You know what? Maybe the aggressive commanding tone that Violet Sabo had, and apparently it's actually on her SOE embarkation forms, maybe that's really important for somebody that's going to do incident command. Maybe that's where that person needs to sit. Maybe Violet would have been a good incident commander. And as we get into this, I don't think it's DevSecOps. I don't think it's DevOps from the point of view of historically. I think having to specify the word security in DevSecOps is backwards. Look, we all know that if you do good code, it's secure. That's just what it is. It has fewer bugs, maybe, maybe not. If we used appropriate practices, we catch those bugs. If we have operations, same thing's true. So why is it DevSecOps? Why isn't it just DevOps? Why do we have to specify security? Maybe it's really just DevOps. And yeah, we're doing these other things to make sure that we're all secure. And we have a team. There are people that are specifically specified to be security people. But what do? They advise, they help. They come alongside teams. They work with our development teams. They work with our operations teams so that we're all secure together, so that we all have the same visibility, so that we have the same observability through the entire stack. So that as we talk about operations and AppSec and all of these other things, we all agree. And I think that's one of the cooler things about some of the observability platforms. And frankly, I work for Datadog, so obviously Datadog. But one of the cooler things about these observability platforms is being able to pull up a concept where this is my thing. Right now, we're looking at this application, and I see this thing, and you see that thing, and the developer sees that thing. And we all agree that that's the problem, as opposed to having different points of view. And all of a sudden, my data center people are using software from 20 years ago, and my application developers are using stuff from right now, and we're disagreeing about whether it's a power fluctuation or the fiber channel being overloaded. We could all look at the same thing and see the same thing. And that's really, frankly, very important. I think observability is key. And as we talk about this, that is going to be the root of what I would urge you to do. I think this is the first place where everybody gets to be at the same place. The first thing that everybody needs to do together. We all agree this is the place we need to sit and talk about the things. And everybody gets a seat at the table. It's not just, Joe and Johnny and Jimmy. It's literally everyone that happens to need to have this observability. Even if you don't think they need to, maybe they're just curious. Maybe that's good enough so that they get into security later, or they get into operations later, or they get into development later. Maybe it helps everybody's opinion. Maybe somebody else has an opinion different than yours, and you actually begin to see things their way. So as we get into this, we have to agree that things are our goal together, and it's not just one thing or another thing or one person's point of view. It turns into everybody all working together. And I want to make sure that I make that clear, that, you know, that turns into reliability. And I think in many ways that is a form of security, that the things that we've done together actually turn into a singular form of security, a singular form of reliability, frankly, a singular business. And that's pretty much my talk. I hope you've all enjoyed it. It went a little quicker than I expected it to this time. But there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Hope I did that right. Thank you, everybody. Got some Q&A.
Yes, we do have some questions in Zoom. Let's see. So the first question is, does CISO really need to be well-versed in the technical field?
I would go with no. I think as long as they're a really good communicator and they're willing to say, like, for instance, if Megan is a really good technical and I am a really good CISO, what does that mean? That means that I'm willing to say, I don't know, and I need to go ask Megan, because Megan knows the right answer. And I think being that honest person is the important part, being the CISO. That's how you earn trust.
And there was kind of a follow-up question to that that says, I'm not sure I understand, how can a CISO be a non-technical team member? I imagine you'd need beyond foundational understanding of technical topics to be able to advise and manage a technical security team. No?
And I think that comes into where you have people specifically answering to the CISO. In my discussion about Chicago, for instance, the CISO that I worked with there really had absolutely no technical understanding whatsoever. They were, however, the most functional CISO that I think I've ever potentially met, in that they got a stupid amount of work done. Why? Because they trusted and worked with their people to make sure they had resources and were able to do the things that they needed to do. Now, he was very good at translating business needs, the things that come fiscally across the business, into things that turn into business requirements or security requirements for the business. So does he have some technical expertise? Sure. Does he have security? No, does not. Does that mean that you don't need a security background to be a good CISO? It definitely helps, but realistically, I think there's also this concept of you have to be a killer communicator.
Somebody asked in chat about the slide deck. The slide deck should be over in the Discord channel under webcast slides. So that is there. Let's see. The recording will be on YouTube under the streams. That was a question there. Let's see. How does the CISO migrate from security theater into the treatment of actual risk within the organization?
So I think the first question is, what does the word risk mean? Generally, I try to define the word risk as something that is specific to the business. It's going to impact the fiscal or the corporate needs, the corporate responsibilities, the things that we've all said that we want to do together. Security theater comes from this concept that we have a bunch of people doing a bunch of things because it feels important, and that's what we saw in the movies. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the ability to evaluate the things that occur inside of our applications and realize that that thing, maybe it's a bug, maybe it's operationally a miss. How does that thing turn into a risk that we've all agreed is a risk? It's going to impact the business's needs and requirements in a negative way that will then turn into a fiscal outcome. Now, I tend to be very, very focused on how much will this cost us, because realistically, I've got to go I have to go work with the CFO. And in working with the CFO, working with the COO, working with the CEO, I need to be able to hand them this is the risk. This is generally how much it's going to cost us, and this is how much the mitigation is going to cost us, so that the mitigation should be less than the risk. And it gives people a very tangible thing that they can go touch and say, hey, oh, I get it. We're not going to spend $10 million on the $1 million risk, but we will spend $1 million on the $10 million risk.
Makes sense. I'm not the CISO. What suggestions would you have for making this case in an environment where there is a strong division between security and operations?
So I think that's really a you question. The reality is that you, as a specific person in that organization, can have the impact that you choose to have. So what does that mean? That might mean going out to dinner with people in the development org. That might mean starting up a D&D game with the people in the operations org. And that being friends and that reaching out from your role into those other roles is really what we're talking about here. You begin the concept of separating, you begin the concept of reintegrating the security world into their world. And over time, and in my experience in Fortune 10s all over the world, that will change the culture. And you will become the hero. And people will see that you're doing something differently and it will matter.
Okay, let's see. Should a security team's skill set need to be more focused on GRC, but include a number of IR folks and technical SMEs for advising the business? So move away from being implementation.
Do you mean by IR is incident response? I think
I'm probably, I would imagine that's.
So I would tell you that I think GRC is the basis for everything that a business should do. So if you don't have good GRC, you don't have good incident response, you don't have good anything. It ends up being, well, we kind of did this thing because if we define what we want to make like engineers and we look at it from a development point of view and we evaluate the things that we're doing from the development point of view, GRC becomes the stories that we need to actually build. So if we think about GRC as writing those stories, then we're not really looking at a number of incident response folks. We're looking at a team of developers, operationalists that will evaluate the thing that they did. And ideally, they'll do a threat model. They'll do all the things that they need to do. And out of that will come the ability to operate that application correctly. And part of operations is incident response, whether that means the pipeline went down today or that means we have, a nation state attacker hitting that application. How are we as a team going to respond? I think there is a place for incident response folks from the point of view of incident commander or understanding how that needs to go. More from the point of view that not everybody responds particularly well in an incident. And getting to the point where you can is a trick and it's a skill and it's not something that people have out of the box.
Our good friend Naomi's here. She said, hi, Nathan, great talk. Who should the CISO report to ideally?
So I don't believe that there's an ideally. I think this depends on the CISO and I think this depends on the leadership structure. I would tell you that it's a really good idea to have it as high as possible in that it should report to the CEO if possible or the board potentially. But that doesn't mean that's the right answer. And I don't think it's the ideal answer either. I've seen it work really well when the CIO, the CTO report to the CISO and vice versa. And that really depends on the people and the focus that those people are having. Now, fun question. Ready, Naomi? If we have a really killer CTO, is there a CISO? If that CTO is thinking about technology and security and everything else, do we have a chief regulatory officer instead? Do we have a chief compliance officer instead of a CISO? Is security rolled into technology so much so that the CTO is the CISO?
Interesting. Okay, so this one's a mouthful.
Oh.
Let's see if I can get through it. Is there perhaps a false dichotomy between technical acumen and communication? Surely it helps communication with engineering team when the executive is conversant in the technology that engineering is building.
I think that's true. I agree with you, Will. I think the problem is as we become technically conversant, that's a skill in and of itself. So I spent most of the beginning of me getting really technical and doing a bunch of really technical things. None of that, and I will be very clear, none of that prepared me to speak. And I think in many ways, it actually went the other way. So as I looked to become a business owner initially and a CTO, it was very hard for me to take myself out of the technical piece, the technical, like being able to speak about a very engineering thing to engineers and then speak to an executive. Honestly, the thing that did it for me was actually owning my own company and becoming an individual who both had to explain to a customer why we're doing a thing, and then also take it back to the engineers and say, this is what the customer actually needs, and this is what they want. Can you do these things? So yes, I just don't think I don't think it's a false dichotomy. I think it is two physical skills.
Let me see, my thing keeps moving. Sorry. What are some of the avenues you could take to prep for being a CISO? Getting a CISSP is obvious for those looking for overall perspective of security, but what else could you do to prepare for the opportunity to become a CISO? What kind of career decisions should I be considering?
Mike, I don't know where you are in your career. I would hope in the next 5 years, the concept of CISO goes away. So if you're preparing for it, I would hope that you're preparing to be the CTO or the CIO of a company as opposed to being the CISO. That said, CISSP or other labels like that, I generally don't give much weight to. I think it's a good way to learn a lot of stuff a little bit very quickly. What I would push for instead is having you read a bunch of books and get really deep in the way that you communicate the concepts for things like NIST or for things like FedRAMP or things like SOC 2. Understand the pieces parts that are there and what those pieces parts are, and then figure out how you would explain them to your 5-year-old kid. Interestingly, I've got 3 kids, not that that's interesting, but communicating what I do as a business, as a job to my children really started to get into, well, how do I communicate what incident response is? And do you really want to communicate about dealing with nation state attackers? And that's what daddy does for a living. And how do you communicate that to a 5-year-old? And I think when we get to the ability to communicate something well, and I think Einstein actually said something to this point, I think we can communicate it to a 5-year-old without being scary or overly dark or overly concerning, and just say, look, daddy makes sure that people are working together and that we're all doing a good thing, and that the things coming out of the things that we're working for are helping other people's lives and making their lives better. So I think it's a different sort of a question. And I would kind of reframe and say, Mike, I hope you end up being a CIO or a CTO, because we've all agreed that security is part of everything.
Do you have an opinion on the path forward when the relationship between operations development with security, for lack of a better term, is adversarial? If the goal is to try and partner with other teams, it's difficult when they want nothing to do with you.
So look, that's the reality of most of the places that I've worked when I've started working there. Frankly, everywhere I've ever been, that's where we started. It's not an easy reality, and I think part of the steps here is to own that and say, look, historically we've screwed up. We've focused on these things. We've tried to put things in front of you. We haven't done a good job. And what I'd like to do is step back and discuss with you how you would like us to work, and what are the things we can do to actually meet the needs that you have, as opposed to telling people what those needs are. Sorry, I am in an Airbnb at DEF CON. You can totally poke your head in if you want to.
What makes a CISO of interest for a CFO? How to get buy-in from a CFO?
So I think this comes into communication. Who are you talking to? Well, I'm talking to the CFO. Well, I got news for you. He or she is very interested in the finances. That's what they want to focus on. So best practice would be to work with them and understand what that looks like, and how do I communicate that fiscal responsibility to the things that we're doing. One of the things that I really like to do, a lot of us will look at being a CISO as being something that is pretty much the loss leader or the cost portion of the business, because we can't make any money. I really like trying to figure out different ways for my group to actually generate income for the business, regardless of what the business is. And you can do that a number of ways. You can come up with new products. You can look for new IP. You can do a lot of things in your particular portion of the world, your vertical, that nobody else is doing. And how can I make the things that I'm doing pay off for that CFO and become friends with him?
Let's see. Tyler said, I joined security from a development background. So I'm one of the converts, as you noted, that didn't have a lot of the older mentality building blocks. With that in mind, what would be my role in pushing this culture forward?
I think it's really just reading books and getting to the point where you feel comfortable security wise, all of the pieces, parts that you feel comfortable with, and being honest about it and taking that into the other folks in development, or taking that back to your security team. One of the things that I did at a Fortune 8 at the time was to start tea with security. We were a health company. We couldn't do whiskey with security, but doing tea with security was culturally acceptable. So every Tuesday morning we would have tea with security, and security development and operations would all sit down regardless of where we were virtually in the world. And we would have tea together, and we'd talk about the different things that were occurring and how we needed to change the things we were doing as a corporate culture to get to a different place. And I think that pushed a lot of developers into, oh, wait, like there's a book about this other thing over here. And my favorite here is emergency diving. Emergency diving has nothing to do with security. It has nothing to do with IT. It has nothing to do with any of these things. But a lot of the principles that we think about from a security point of view are rolled into what an emergency diver or a rescue diver actually thinks about. So taking yourself out of the position that you're in, taking it out of any of the pride or political issues that you have, and reading about something that somebody else feels about, and how can we learn ostensibly from what they've learned, and taking that back in is really important.
Somebody said, brilliant session. Do you have more BHIS or more, sorry, it went away, more sessions, training on information security, more on NIST, at SOC, ISO?
So one of the things that I am desperately trying to do is write a couple of classes for Black Hills this year. It is definitely on my list of to-dos.
Yay.
I'm hoping I can do an O2, back in the diving, sorry. OT security and OT incident response course, as well as doing a basic being a CISO course, and how to do it well.
A very pressing question. Do you like apple pie?
I love apple pie. In fact, my personal favorite though is we call it apple crisp. I don't know what you call it, but it's basically an apple pie with like a brown sugar and
yes, and then you put ice cream.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's honestly my favorite thing in the entire world.
Yes, that is very, very good.
You would like me to post that to Discord? I will post my recipe for apple crisp.
Along the same lines of the technical acumen question, I hear so often about the need for an MBA for a CISO to have business acumen. Could that not be gained through exposure and experience, and just trying to keep things very bottom line up front and communicate how security supports the business objectives?
Dude, I completely wish I had gone that way. The reality is that you can do it any way you want to do it. Again, I really feel like business is the important thing to know when you get into being a CISO. And if you can discuss it from a business point of view, you'll be fine. Now, if you got that knowledge, same way I did, school of hard knocks, doing it yourself, owning a business, more power to you. Pain and suffering went with that. If you're an individual that's just starting your career, dude, go MBA all the way.
I don't know if this is a question, more of a comment. It says, I feel like there's a lot of attention being paid to individuals at the executive level as playing a critical role when they really just have a specific role. My experience is that a good executive surrounds themselves with the SMEs and builds trust with those SMEs, that they're providing the solutions and answers that the executive needs. Not everyone can be a CISO, CTO, CIO, but those SMEs provide just as much, if not more, needed skills and capability.
I completely agree with you. And I think that one of the things that we get into when we start talking about any of the C-level roles is that we focus on perfection, and doing it from the point of view that we're doing it now, where that CISO or that CTO needs to be the type of person that can't make mistakes and has to know everything all the time, is foolish. Let's be honest, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to screw up. And the concept of doing a CTO or doing a CIO, doing a CEO role without making mistakes is just pretending that reality doesn't exist. So as we take part what you said. I completely agree. When we go back to the Chicago example, guy in Chicago had literally zero technical expertise, unbelievable trust with the executives, and unbelievable ability to communicate what his technical SMEs had given him so that he could go back and communicate that to the executives well. And I think that is the epitome of what you're talking about there. I will point out, he did not see himself above his reports. So he did not feel like he was the CISO, big chest out moment, and like important. He felt like he was the individual that pulled everybody together and helped carry that forward so that people could work together. And I think that was honestly, he's got a lot of my respect. If I could have gotten a hold of him, I would have given you his name. But yeah, he's a pretty special person.
Is there a Nathan Case top 10 must read book list?
So yeah, there are. I've posted it a couple of times in LinkedIn in the last couple of weeks. I will post it again. I would tell you that any of the threat modeling pieces are important. I really like Kelly's book on chaos engineering that she just put out. Kelly Shortridge just put out a couple of weeks ago. Let's see. I think I don't actually have it up here. I would tell you that anything that gets to the point of what you want to do. So while I have a top 10 list, they tend to be books that focus on incident response or threat hunting or DFIR. They do not tend to be books that I would suggest everybody read. So let's pretend that Megan here would like, what is your security picadillo? What do you enjoy, Megan?
For security, absolutely nothing. That's not my thing here.
So making friends and winning.
Yeah. I do more of the support. So I just like hang out with you guys. So security stuff is just not something that I do. I mean, I've absorbed so much like in classes, like I usually sit on the back end of all of John's classes. So I know enough to know the lingo and to be a little bit dangerous. But as far as me reading a security type book, I've read none.
Okay, well,
So.
and that's fine. But the point being that you have different interests than I do. And
Yes, definitely.
talk about development, operations, and security. We all have very different opinions.
Yes.
Hit me on LinkedIn. Tell me what you're interested in. And
Are you in Discord?
Yeah.
What is your handle? Maybe
Karmic, KARMIC.
Okay.
A long time ago in the 80s.
Okay. We'll just make sure. Because we're almost at the top of the hour. So if you want to hang out, I don't know if you've got to go.
I actually have to go get to my talk at.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll save any questions if anybody has any questions that they want to post over in the Discord channel that we can get to you. We can do that for later. But thank
totally
you so much for coming. And I'm sure it's probably a little stressful being, having to do this and then go do another talk, but
all good.
We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you in Deadwood.
Laters.
All right. Well, have a good day, everyone. Ryan, go ahead and kill it with fire.